morning and welcome to A View from the Warfighter, the first session of the National Security Track underwritten by the Aerospace Corporation. If you have questions for the speakers during this session, please enter them into the chat feature. You may need to click on the Track 2 chat box in the upper left to be able to do so. And now we are pleased to welcome Randy Kendall, Vice President for Launch and Enterprise Operations at the Aerospace Corporation, to introduce this session. Randy?
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the AIAA and the Aerospace Corporation, I'd like to welcome everyone to our first panel of the National Security Space Track, A View from the Warfighter. It seems just a few short years ago, we weren't even supposed to use the words war and space in the same sentence. And now, not only is it okay to talk about fighting and winning a war that extends into space, but no discussion of warfighting is complete or even credible without addressing the role of space. The fact is that space capabilities have become central to many military operations, including missile warning, geolocation and navigation, target identification, and tracking of adversary activities. So it's essential to understand the transition from being space operators to space warfighters and how to best support those endeavors. And to start this discussion, we first need to understand the needs of the warfighter relative to the threats. Space support to regional COCOM, STRATCOM, and SOCOM can't be overstated.
The first session of the National Security Track underwritten by the Aerospace Corporation. If you have questions for the speakers during this session, please enter them into the chat feature. You may need to click on the Track 2 chat box in the upper left to be able to do so.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the AIAA and the Aerospace Corporation, I'd like to welcome everyone to our first panel of the National Security Space Track, A View from the Warfighter. It seems just a few short years ago, we weren't even supposed to use the words war and space in the same sentence. And now, not only is it okay to talk about fighting and winning a war that extends into space, but no discussion of warfighting is complete or even credible without addressing the role of space. The fact is that space capabilities have become central to many military operations, including missile warning, geolocation and navigation, target identification, and tracking of adversary activities. So it's essential to understand the transition.
Hey, Randy, this is Chris with PSAV. If you have the live stream open on your computer, are you able to close that?
Understand the needs of the warfighter relative to the threats. Space support to regional COCOM. And we're back. Okay, so as we look to explore the needs, where the needs are, the space enterprise, where the space enterprise is delivering on its promise and where they see the future gaps. And so in order to lead that discussion, let me introduce our moderator for this panel, Kay Sears, the Vice President and General Manager of the Military Space Line of Business for Lockheed Martin. In the interest of time, I won't read her full bio, but it's available online. Suffice it to say that with almost 3 decades of experience in the space and satellite communications industry, and in rapid response solutions for both military and civil agencies, she's the perfect leader for this panel. So at this point, Kay, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Randy, and welcome to everybody zooming in to this AIAA Ascend event. I've got a very distinguished panel of space warfighters with experience from across the globe in space operations, and I'm excited to introduce them and give them a chance to make some opening comments around their view as warfighters in space. Of course, as Randy mentioned, you know, the role of space as a warfighting domain is fairly new. Space has been supporting other warfighting operations for quite some time, but now it's got to fight its own war in space. And many say that that might be where it all starts. So let me move quickly through our panel introductions, and we'll let each one make some opening comments. And then please send your questions, as I've got a few questions, but I really want to hear from the audience and those that are listening in on what you would like to hear these space warfighters discuss. So first, I'd like to introduce Commander Gregory Arnold. As the Pacific Fleet's Senior Space Advisor, Commander Arnold leads readiness, coordination, and synchronization of space warfighting activities in preparation for large-scale, multi-domain combat operations. As a naval strategist, joint planner, and naval space cadre commander, Arnold was selected to serve as the first chief of operations for the Joint Interagency Combined Space Operations Center, and subsequently led the plans, strategy, and special technical operations departments of the National Space Defense Center at Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. So Commander Arnold, over to you for some opening comments.
Well, thank you. A very good early morning to the virtual audience and fellow panelists. I'm sure it'll be another glorious Hawaii sunrise here in about 2 hours. My name is Greg Arnold. I lead space operations for the Pacific Fleet at a Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. Navy space is a small cadre, particularly at the operational level of war. So my role out here translates into everything from budget recommendations to exercises and war games and planning and execution. As we enter this new pivotal time for national security space, many similarities can be seen in the Navy's mission out here. Sea power is similar to space in its ability to project national power and prosperity. Navy must achieve both superiority and rules-based order and stability at the same time. And space has a very similar challenge. National objectives and victory. So thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this discussion today.
Thank you very much, Commander Arnold, and for getting up so early to join us. Next, I have Colonel Eric Little. He is the Deputy Commander of Operations at Peterson Air Force Base, a role he began this summer after passing on command of the 1st Space Brigade, which he led since July 2018 and moved to their current home at Peterson Air Force Base. During his tenure overseeing the Space Brigade, Colonel Little maintained 5 rotational deployments, upgraded equipment, realigned the 53rd Signal Battalion under the new Satellite Operations Brigade. Under his guidance, the Space Brigade's Joint Tactical Ground Station provided early missile warning during Iran's missile attack on Iraq, which allowed US and allied forces to take cover and minimize losses. So over to you, Colonel Little, for some opening comments.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction. Good morning from Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and thanks to the AIAA for the opportunity to really represent Army space. More importantly, to provide the land warfighters' perspective on why space is so important. So my opening remarks, I'm going to keep to about 5 minutes. I'm going to be a little bit longer than the previous speaker, hopefully to queue up some good questions later. But starting with positioning, navigation, and timing, satellite communications, ISR, all these capabilities and effects from space are indispensable to the American way of land warfare. An interesting statistic is that each one of the Army's brigade combat teams is equipped with over 2,500 pieces of space-enabled equipment. So in quantity, really, the Army is the largest service with regard to utilization of space-enabled capabilities. In order to So really, I'm here to discuss the integration of those space capabilities into operations for the land domain. But in order to do this, it's important to have a baseline and understanding of the operational environment. And that kind of leads me to the topic already mentioned, with focusing around multi-domain operations. But the last 20 years of conflict that we've seen against really non-near peers has not really forced us to maneuver at the speed that we're going to have to do against a near peer. And superiority in any one domain against a near peer in a future conflict, we're not going to have extended superiority or dominance in any one domain. So really, that's what multi-domain operations is about, is achieving periods of dominance at the time and place of our choosing in a particular domain. Quick example for that is in order to enable the land component to maneuver, the Air Force, the air component oftentimes has to go in and set the conditions. In order to do that, IADS is a challenge. So we may leverage space and cyber to provide effects to influence or shape the battlefield with the IADS in order to enable the Air Force. So that's just a very quick example of how all the domains are enabling the other domains. Space is absolutely a huge, huge part of that. The 3 tenets of multi-domain operations: calibrated force posture, multi-domain formations, and really the Army is moving out smartly on the multi-domain formations. And then the last one, rapid and continuous integration of all warfighting domains. But a key element and task for the Army with multi-domain operations is integrating space-based capabilities at the operational and tactical level, really at an unprecedented speed and scale. And from the Army's perspective, that's, and we may get into challenges and gaps that we have, but the ability to move fast within this domain, because we haven't been stressed against a near peer, is one of the challenges that I foresee. And I'm starting to wrap up, but if you take nothing away from my message today, I hope to communicate that we really need to improve and do better at integrating space capabilities down to the operational and tactical levels. We've proven we can provide effects on the battlefield in the CENTCOM region. Again, against a near peer, we're really going to be challenged with that effort. But again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Colonel Little. You brought up some great points. I definitely have a follow-up question for you that I'll ask around that tactical space element, which I think is almost a new emerging mission area as you've depicted. Going to move now to Colonel Chris Putman. Colonel Putman is the Chief, Current Operations Headquarters, United States Space Force at the Pentagon. He has served with Space Forces since 2015 with roles including Space Policy Analyst and Chief Space Control Policy, Office of the Undersecretary of Defense at the Pentagon in Washington. He was also Director of Space Forces, Pacific Air Forces, Joint Base Pearl Harbor in Hickam. Colonel Putnam deployed multiple times to the Combined Air and Space Operations Center at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, as well as Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, in support of Operations Southern Watch, Enduring Freedom, and Iraqi Freedom. It's great to have you join us, Colonel Putman.
Hey, good morning, and thank you. It's a pleasure to join you. Actually, I'm in Crystal City. There's not a lot of office space for us Space Force personnel in the Pentagon right now, so they've got us spread all over. So yes, we're about 2 miles south of the Pentagon. But a couple things I'd like to touch on for introductory remarks is my first exposure to warfighter support from the space perspective, as you mentioned in my background, was working in the AOC during the kickoff to OIF. That's where we had the first senior space officer to eventually evolved into the director of Space Forces. And at that time, it was largely an Air Force game, but my experience was that in the course of those 3-4 months, we made huge strides forward in joint integration to the point that we codified the Deputy Director of Space Forces being an Army officer. And, if nothing else, that was a huge gain out of that initial conflict when OIF started. I would say that 3 or 4 weeks when we initially moved north into Iraq is probably a point in history where it's probably the closest thing we can look at, where we had an adversary that was almost on par with us, and we were pretty dynamic in the way we tasked, exercised, and executed space operations. So I would definitely agree with Colonel Little that the last 20 years have maybe not taught us a whole lot of near-peer adversary conflict with respect to space. There may be some lessons learned back in that short 3-4 week period when we initially went north into Iraq, especially from a joint integration standpoint. I'll move forward to my recent experience as the Director of Space Forces at PACAF. So I was fortunate enough to help stand up the DIRS Space 4 20 years ago in CENTCOM, and then I got to be a DIRS Space 4 in INDOPACOM, which was great. I will say in that intervening 18 years or so, frankly, not a lot changed for support to the warfighter from a capability or capacity standpoint. But I think we're on the cusp of significant changes going forward from both capability, capacity, and organizational standpoint, and inter-service coordination. I would say the other big difference I noticed in that intervening time is the willingness of the U.S. to integrate with our allies, and both the allies coming to us wanting to integrate from a space warfighting perspective. Maybe that's a little bit of the countries in those two AORs, but from my viewpoint, that was definitely a significant difference in that 20 years. And like I mentioned, we're on the cusp of bringing a lot of capability and capacity to the warfighter and the new organizations from Space Force, Spacecom, and the services. So great challenges lie ahead of us, and more importantly, great opportunity. So again, appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you, and I'll conclude there with my opening remarks.
Thank you, Colonel Putman. Definitely want to follow up with you on the allied question, so we'll get into that. Last but not least, Colonel Roberson. I would like to introduce him. Colonel Roberson is the Director of Space Forces for Air Force Special Operations Command. He is assigned to the A3 to organize, train, and equip forces, and for space operations, integration, and reach back to the U.S. Space Command and U.S. Space Force. He is the Senior Space Operator and Advisor in the U.S. Special Operations Command. He assists SOCOM and components with space operations issues, force management, future plans, and concept development. Prior to his assignment at AFSOC, he was the Director of Space Forces for U.S. Air Forces Europe and Air Forces Africa. So a lot of great geographic experience. Thanks, Colonel Roberson.
Thank you very much for having me join you today. It's really an honor, and it's good to see some of my current and former colleagues on the panel as well. So good to see you guys. A lot of great points that they've made. Some things that I would like to highlight is that we've all been doing space for 2+ decades, and over those 20 years, people have been saying space is growing for the past 2 decades. But now we're actually seeing that space is getting much more visible. It doesn't take a nation state to go into space and have space operations. You see companies going there and companies providing a lot of that commercial capability. General Raymond's highlighted, Chief of Space Operations has highlighted multiple times that we don't want to fight in space, but we have to be prepared to, because it is a contested environment. Not just the electromagnetic environment being contested, but the physical environment that is space, which is above 100 kilometers. When we talk about the needs of the warfighter, it is complex. It depends. The answer would be, it depends. It depends on who you're talking to, a Marine, the Navy, the Army, or a space operator, or a special operator. So a Director of Space Forces and Special Operations is a new concept that General Raymond brought, because he said, how do I know what I don't know? SOF brings a lot to all those domains, and what can they bring to space? I think the perspective I wanted to highlight today is that we've all done, or we're all aware of bringing space effects to those other domains, but what can those other domains do to help space? So what can SOF do to help space? And that's a perspective we've been having SOF think about and look at, is what can they do to help General Raymond and now General Dickinson as the Spacecom commander in that space fight. So I think not just looking at what the space provides to other domains, but what do the other domains provide to space, and space as a supported fight? How does that look? I think those are some good thoughts to kick around today. So again, thank you for having me today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you all for those introductory comments. I've got some questions I'll kick off, but feel free to jump in. We've got this set up so you guys can comment on each other's and don't feel constrained by the format in any way. So space is, as a warfighting domain, probably has the biggest AOR, right? Everything above a certain height is all space, part of the space AOR now. But when you think about the traditional AORs, what kinds of things did space bring to those AORs? And if you can address what might be, we've already experienced, but what you see going forward in the future to help support those combatant commanders and the other services. So this is more around space as support, as a support to those operations. Anybody want to jump in on that?
So this is a little, I'll go ahead and start if that's all right. I'll try to be brief in my response to allow my colleagues to respond. But I would say, and I did have the privilege of serving with Colonel Putman in Indo-PACOM theater for some time when he was a DS4. But during my time at the theater level in Indo-PACOM, I observed over 3 years the awareness of and the need to be able to provide non-lethal effects with space capabilities to support maneuver on the ground. And the JTF commanders in theater fights, the transition from almost predominantly kinetic fires during exercises with little to no non-lethal fires. So, when I left in 2018, the preponderance of fires that we were working in support of the JTF were non-lethal fires leveraging effects from space. So the awareness of what we on the space side need to provide to support maneuver, both in all domains, the maritime domain, the land domain, the air domain. It's imperative that we figure out how to provide those effects in support of maneuver. Over.
I think one thing I'll add to that from Greg out here in Pacific Fleet is nowhere are the stakes higher for great power competition than here in the Pacific. Daily we're facing threats that challenge our freedom of operation in the area. But there is no better signal than a free and open Indo-Pacific in the free and open Indo-Pacific than U.S. Navy operations in the region. That's why we continue to fly, sail, and operate whenever we can in international waters as international law allows. Because space operations underpin our collective maritime efforts in the region in almost every way. So we really, as we look at across all our components, capacity is something that we need to discuss and look forward to as we build and grow.
And is that capacity from a comms perspective primarily? Yeah.
Yeah, certainly comms is going to be critical. A lot of demanding users out there in this theater.
Yeah, great. Any other comments on the AOR support to operations?
Yes, this is Colonel Roberson. I'll make a couple of comments. I think what we're going to see is more resilience in the space environment, commercial providers as well. A lot of high throughput satellite systems going into low Earth orbit. SATCOM used to be a GEO, mostly a GEO game. Of course, others were in LEO, but we're seeing a lot of high throughput satellites. So we'll see some more resilience, as well as a quicker replenishment with companies as SpaceX, for example, and other quick launch options to replenish. And there even Rand and others are looking at some studies for doing through space logistics. So actually getting something to another part of the world within an hour rather than a couple of days. And then we talk about great power competition, but I think in the future, we're also going to see great power partnerships in the if we want to call it the good guy, great powers, where we're seeing so much now that is releasable to our Four Eyes partners, and you scale it back a little bit to with the Brits, we're releasing, we work together so well, and General Raymond has really pushed to get sharing across the alliances from the closest to the next closest, NATO, and then even farther out from there. Over.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we're doing a lot of detailed analysis as both industry with Space Force on that layered defense approach to really measure resiliency. I personally believe resiliency can be measured when you compare it with an architecture threat by threat, right? And it's a pretty detailed analysis you have to go through, but I think that is the kind of data we need in order to develop a multi-layered architecture, whether you're talking about comm or missile warning. The LEO layer adds to the GEO layer. There's a role for MEO in all of those mission areas, and it's kind of a defense in depth type of thing. But I think there's a lot of work going on right now in those architectures. Okay, so I wanted to follow up on that question with gaps. So we talk about what space can bring and what it has brought to the fight in our history, but there are clearly some gaps, and obviously we don't want to get too much into anything that's classified here, nothing classified, but can you comment on some of the gaps? And as you look at different AORs and those combatant commanders, is space part of their integrated priority in terms of their priorities? Throw that out to Colonel Little first.
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. And Colonel Roberson touched on kind of where we're going. He talked about the resilience. So the resilience piece is one area I'll touch on, and I think we're becoming more resilient. You're seeing a lot of leveraging commercial capabilities, smaller satellites in low Earth orbit to address a gap, to get more persistent coverage. Really, on the Army side, there's a big push to have that tactical space layer, and that's to address those gaps to give us more persistence. Another common gap, and I've heard General Raymond comment on this on numerous occasions, and at the broader level, but also this is relevant to the Army and the Space Brigade that I had 2 years previous, and that is the intelligence function, intelligence support to space operations, and really we're moving forward and we're seeing progress, but it's a gap, and it goes back to a very a comment that General Raymond also made, that space is hard. The front end work to leverage space capabilities, and especially when you tie it into the targeting process and the intelligence functions that feed that, are pretty significant, and that's one of the gaps that I've heard General Raymond highlight and I've seen as well. Over.
Hey, this is Colonel Putman. To follow on with Colonel Little's comments, from an intelligence standpoint and the tactical warfighter, it's how do we have situational awareness at the warfighter level of what actually is going on in space? So a COP, if you will, for space, to enable the tactical warfighter to make decisions without having to rely on reach back or a PowerPoint or a phone call, but rather push the information to him so he has situational awareness of the on-orbit activities or fight, if you will, so he can make decisions that are both supporting his commander and are not perpendicular possibly to the U.S. Spacecom commander. And right now that doesn't really exist. And frankly, that's one of the things I'm working on up here is how do we develop situational awareness at now that we have a service headquarters of everything that's going on at our level all the way down to the tactical level.
Yeah, related to that, Colonel Putman, do everybody wants as much data as they can get, and I'm sure there's a lot of data falling on the floor even today that we don't capture in some of the op centers, and then we're driving more sensors, right? We want everything to be a sensor, the F-35, the Aegis, everything. Let's have it be a sensor and consolidate all that information to give operational pictures to folks that have to make real-time decisions. But like you said, there's a huge challenge with that, and just in terms of the massive amount of data that would be. So do you see AI, machine learning, some of these future technologies being critical then for space operations and to meet this speed challenge?
I hope so. Clearly not my area of expertise, but I will say that basically at a theater standpoint, at least at the operational level, our essay on the space domain AOR has basically been static for the last 20 years. So anything would be better than what we have right now. So yeah, I believe AI machine learning would be great, and especially if it's something that you can let the user decide what he needs to know without relying on somebody else to make that decision for you.
So we have a couple questions in from the audience actually related to the ground challenges. Specifically, what are the COCOM ground infrastructure integration challenges, both within the systems that span across the different services, but also even within those host countries? Think about, I guess, foreign territories as well, at allied territories where we are. Any comment on the ground challenges?
Are you talking about infrastructure to support the space fight, or tactical maneuver type forces?
No, I think ground infrastructure to support the space fight. I mean, it's back to bringing all this data together to build an operational picture. I mean, there has to be a lot of good and secure infrastructure in order to do that. I know on the space side, we're adding things like optical links so that we can move data across a constellation and get it into secure areas versus a really huge and costly sophisticated ground infrastructure. But welcome your comments on that.
Yeah, and I think both Commander Arnold and Colonel Little will agree to this, that the tyranny of distance and the lack of solid land in Indo-PACOM makes that a particularly hard problem to solve. Of where can we get infrastructure in and where can we maintain it, and that's always a point of contention, because there's just not a lot of good options to get the ground infrastructure where we need it in relation to both our allies and our adversaries. So in the Indo-PACOM case, it may not be a question of ground infrastructure. It's how do we leverage airborne and naval capabilities to bring us what we need. And I'll let the other two gentlemen fill in if I missed something there.
Yeah, I'll certainly add to that. You asked for a ground perspective, but I'll give you a maritime one. I think we certainly have unique challenges in our environment. And I think integration of future space capabilities in the naval architecture is certainly one of those. It can almost go into your previous gap question. But we're gonna have to figure out how to integrate and synchronize national security space into our theater maritime, and then a similar infrastructure in place for capital assets afloat. So as new capability comes along, both of those places have to be integrated over.
And so I'll chime in quick. I think it's a great question. If you ask a lot of folks where does space start, they'll tell you, 100 kilometers up, space domain starts. The warfighter is going to tell you space starts on the ground, because that's where the users are at. You concur with the tyranny of distance challenges that Chris Putman brought up as well. So and I talked a little bit before about where the Army, the land component, is going with regard to non-lethal effects. And a challenge is, one, just sheer quantity. If you look at the Red Order battle compared to what we have, it's we have some room to improve there for sure. But bringing those capabilities, we view, because they're so few in number, the capabilities as a strategic capability. But we have got to be able to position those capabilities on the ground and employ them at the tactical and operational level, and not necessarily tied to the ground. But two challenges I really would like to bring up and highlight are the authorities that go into employing some of these capabilities, as well as the C2 structure to fight them. And again, I think it's because the adversary we've been up against the last 20 years, we can accomplish our mission and defeat our adversary at a very slow and methodical pace. It's very deliberate, where the authorities are retained up pretty high. A near peer, we're going to have to move a lot faster. So I kind of got off your question, but I wanted to throw that in there. Thank you.
No, your authorities question, I think, or statement is a really good one. I was in a wargaming, Schriever War Games with then Lieutenant General Raymond, and he realized how complicated the authorities could be just to deploy some space capability. So I think there has to be a streamlining, obviously, of that. Also, I would say verification and validation is another. The information that we receive is coming fast and it's changing fast. How do we change the V&V process so that we don't have to verify everything as it's coming in? Because I think that loop is going to make that OBE pretty quickly. So just a comment there. One follow-on question that we received from Mr. Fega is, the Army has just led a contract on alternative PNT to protect against GPS outage. How might this alternative service be provided? So anybody want to take a shot at that? I know the reliance on space is certainly a concern, and this idea of resiliency is critical, but alternative PNT to protect against an outage of that system for weapon systems and other operations.
I'll make a quick comment on that. Yes, it relates to the previous gap list that you mentioned and priorities. So those are priority things. So that's why the Army's led a contract. There's also interest in, as you mentioned, they're going to want more. Warfighters want more data. And they want ready, reliable PNT, and the next generation of GPS satellites is going to have more capabilities. And we've got a couple of those on orbit already. And but in the meantime, what's the gap in that we see that you can look online and see how do you jam the GPS signal, and the impacts of that are pretty big to the commercial industry and to I think we're more resilient on the military side, but the commercial users have problems with that now. Now, how they're going to do alternates for PNT? Well, that's the industry is so great right now that that's one of the great things that we can leverage industry and throw the problem set out to industry, and they come back with some of these great solutions. I've had the privilege to interact with AFWorks and SoftWorks to give back some unique solutions for problem sets that they're looking at. So I can't answer how they're going to do that, but I think there will be some very interesting solutions rather than going back to the old, I guess the 60s, 70s LORAN-C system where you had antennas triangulating where people were around. But I think I'll be interested to see what they come forward with that we can talk about at the unclassified level. Over to others.
I'll add on to that. This is Colonel Putman. So we need to get out of the mindset that PNT equals GPS. Alternative PNT is all sorts of systems, but down that road from a tactical warfighter perspective, it's great that we develop all these systems, but how do we give them the user equipment? Because that's part of any system that enables the utilize the alternative PNT sources, right? So we don't want them burdened with the GPS receiver, a LORAN receiver as one example, or pick the number of receivers. How do we give them the capability to actually use multiple sources and all the other potential solutions that are out there? And this will probably affect the Army the most because they're the ones that are probably rucking it and have to add the weight to their kit. Over.
I'll quickly add on to that. And so resiliency is the key word, and it's not all it's not all space-based. So there's efforts on the terrestrial side to ensure we have that positioning, navigation, and timing. And there's no question at the onset of conflict with a near peer, there's going to be a huge fog of war, because D3SOE, denied, degraded, disrupted space operating environment. We're gonna live that. And the efforts we're seeing with the alternate PNT are going to enable us to quickly get out of that fog of war and regroup and win in conflict. But again, I won't speak to all the efforts that are going on with that within PNT, but it's there's space-based resiliency, there's terrestrial-based, and as a warfighter, I started out using a map and compass. In some efforts, we need to get back to some of the basic skills to get through the initial fog of war that I talked about. But I think they're on track with the efforts to make sure we are resilient. Over.
Yeah, I would just say it's definitely an and, not an or, right? And I have the 3 and 3F programs in my portfolio, and we do have to start to think of GPS as a warfighting system. I mean, I think that's one of the things we've taken for granted for quite a long time. So there are resiliency enhancements coming, and we need to add that in with other forms of PNT to create a very resilient framework for warfighting. So I appreciate that question. We have one other from the audience. How can the commercial industry help to provide alternative or resilient services for things like communications and PNT and other mission areas? How do you guys view the commercial piece of this?
I'll go ahead and make a couple comments there because I think it's they'll be able to respond quickly. They're not as I mean, I don't want to slam our acquisition process, but they can acquire things. Their processes are a bit quicker. You know, General Raymond has highlighted that with this creation of the Space Force, he wants things to be flatter, redo acquisition, make that quicker. We have Rapid Capabilities Office out there. We have you know, other let's get things to the warfighters quickly offices and processes. But the things that commercial industry are providing, are going to be providing. So SpaceX is unique so far in that they can build and launch their own things. So as they populate the Starlink, and then as OneWeb, you know, gets back online with the help of the Brits and other high throughput systems, commercially, you're going to see a lot of resilience in our ability for SATCOM and data transmission. You also, there's a big use, you mentioned the ground segment vulnerabilities. Well, there's commercial teleports as well. So there's commercial teleports around the world. You don't necessarily have to stick your own system out there alone and unafraid or heavily guarded and protected into an area. So I think commercial brings a lot, both in what they are contracted to provide and in their unique innovations that they present to solve the problem sets that we tee up. So I think commercial is a critical partner. Over.
Yeah, I'll add that I think commercial might be able to provide a unique view on disruptive technology, you know, new concepts that'll change our view of the adversary's calculus, which would be good. Potential quick wins that were just discussion action in the Navy. And it's been talked about a lot, but the leveraging commercial space in the private sector for redundancy and resiliency and rapid reconstitution are all important aspects that they can add.
Yeah, and this is Colonel Pubman. I think one of the other big things about commercial gives us a huge opportunity to work with our allies and partners with, as I think we'll all acknowledge that the classification of a lot of our US only systems prevents the sharing of information, and a lot of times the commercial systems give us the opportunity to start the dialogue with our partners and build those relationships and actually be productive in this domain going forward. Over.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add to what commercial can bring as well, which has to do with a lot of this big data management. I mean, some of the AI machine learning, we should be able to look at industry for that, and even, you know, like the gaming industry, for example, how they're managing big data. You know, certainly Amazon and others have big data platforms. So something I know industry is looking at, how to partner with those, you know, really non-military industries to learn from them. But you mentioned allies, Colonel Putman. I wanted to ask more about that. Can you talk about engagement with our allied partners in space operations? And is that engagement driven by us or by the partner? And what do you see them bringing to the space fight?
Yeah, you know, I left Indo-PACOM 2 months ago, but I'm still getting a lot of the emails from a lot of the our foreign partners. So I'm kind of still in the loop on that a little bit, but I would say it's definitely driven by our partners. You know, Indo-PACOM, probably Japan's at the forefront of that, followed closely by Korea and India and other nations. They know there's some secret sauce out there and they want to be part of it, but because we haven't been able to share, they don't quite understand what they're asking for. They just know that they want to be part of it. One of the tricky things being in theater is that, you know, we might want to have engagement with our partners at our COCOM level, but we definitely don't want to get out ahead of US Spacecom or US Space Force. They really got the stick. So we don't want to make a security releasability decision that goes perpendicular to what they're doing at Spacecom. So it's a fine balancing point between all those equities to ensure that we're doing the right thing. So, and I know Space Force and Spacecom are standing up some organizations at the CSPOC, et cetera, to help out with that. So we're doing the best we can to integrate with Japan and the other nations, but you know, it's a little bit, we got to wait to make sure that Spacecom's got all their ducks in line, and then we'll push forward. But there's a definite appetite out there from the partner nations. Over.
I guess my conversations with a lot of our allies are exactly what you've described. They're disappointed in what we can share, and there's a huge balance there that we have to strike. They're eager to provide something to the architecture, but they're not quite sure what they can bring. I think, obviously geographically, we've got some great allies in key places, and space situational awareness seems to be, or space domain awareness seems to be a great place where they could contribute. I don't know, Commander Arnold, if you agree with that, but certainly the Aussies could help a lot in your COCOM.
Yeah.
So another question is really around this tactical space. We see that as kind of a new mission area that's emerging. Colonel Little, you mentioned it, and the Army is really, I think, the recipient of this, of these capabilities, a lot of which were, in a non-denied area provided by unmanned aerial vehicles to help with ISR. In a denied area, I would assume space would have to play a critical role in that tactical data to the warfighter, space to shooter, things like that. Can you talk a little bit how you see space playing a role in the tactical area?
Yep, sorry, I had an issue with my mute button there. I mean, there's no question, and you talked about it's going to be a denied, degraded, disrupted operating environment that we're going to be fighting in, at least at the onset. The capabilities that the warfighter leverages, I mean, we've covered the gamut from positioning, navigation, and timing, SATCOM, ISR. Everything the Army does, shoot, move, and communicate, we rely on space in order to get that done. And we fight and maneuver at the tactical level. So we've got to bring it down from the strategic level down to the tactical operational level. And we have proven that we've done that in the past, but not at the speed that we need. And the challenges I talked about with authorities and the C2 structure are what are hindering that speed. And we're certainly moving in the right direction. The stand-up of Space Command and Space Force, there's tremendous awareness and a lot of resources going towards space right now to address this. And the Army's really pushing hard to bring a lot of those capabilities down to support that tactical maneuver. So I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. I mean, again, it's all on class here. So given the stand-up of the U.S. Space Force, though, do you see any difference in the support you're getting, as the Army or the Navy in terms of your requirements for space capabilities and the integration of that into these bigger architectures?
Yeah, from my perspective, not at all. I mean, I think the stand-up of Space Force is a great thing. It's still very new, so we're kind of still figuring out what this means to the Army, what it means to the Navy and their capabilities. Space Force has taken on a lot of responsibility. And again, it's just recognition from senior leaders that we've got to do better at getting after this domain. But I've seen no difference. The command I'm in, Army Space and Missile Defense Command, is the Army Service Component Command to U.S. Space Command, and our functions and roles, responsibilities with the stand-up Space Force haven't really changed.
Yeah, this is Greg from the fleet. I would share a similar view to Colonel Little there. This idea of tactically focused units also applies to the fleet. Being able to protect and support fleet maneuver in terms of in an element view is very similar. And I think one thing we'll see emerging over the next few years is the idea of organic space assets that'll provide us with flexibility and responsiveness, capacity, priority, our own authority and control. That's stuff those will be things we'll have to work out with Space Force move.
we have a lot of industry who are dialed in, and defense industry folks as well, who are really anxious to know what industry can do to support the warfighter in space, in national security space and space operations. Do you have some comments for industry? Anything from where we should be making critical investments of our R&D as we look to deploy future capabilities, to, you know, the threat, the speed of the threat? We've touched on a lot of different gaps, but any other comments on where industry can really support the warfighter in space?
So I'll quickly go, and it ties back to a lot of my previous comments, and it is, we need resilience, and Colonel Roberson kind of talked to that in his opening remarks, but and we have to be able to move fast. So the days of the exquisite capabilities that are very vulnerable, I think those are behind us. I think we need to be able to rapidly replenish what we have, and we need to be able to move fast in doing so.
Any other comments to industry or wrap-up comments? We're almost at the end of our time, so please feel free to give some final comments. Come on, Colonel Putman.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say resilience, but Eric Little already said that. I mean, I can't emphasize enough the avoiding stovepipes, and given the tactical warfighter flexibility, and it gets back to the authorities, and you know what Greg just said on you know, the naval forces is, how do I give the guy in the field the authority and the situational awareness to make a decision that supports not only his commander in the theater, but also U.S. Spacecom, and give him the resilience so that if option A doesn't work, he can roll over to option B and make multiple decisions. And you know, that's going to be a huge challenge. How does a tactical warfighter create effect in space that supports his scheme of maneuver right here and now for the next 10, 15 kilometers, but doesn't go perpendicular to what U.S. Spacecom's doing? And how do we synchronize those efforts? So what are those tools that can help us ensure that we're, you know, maybe not rowing in sync, but at least rowing in the same direction? Over.
I have a comment on your question regarding what industry can look at as well. I think after Colonel Putman finished there, I think that we have to look at the space littorals. So what are those other things where we're touching other domains? And one of the highlights is the cyber domain. So everything we put in space, there's no cable running to it. So it's going through the electromagnetic environment. And while we've been talking a long time about baking in information assurance through the acquisition process and getting something out there, well, we also look for those vulnerabilities after we get something and say, aha, we didn't think of that. And there's a vulnerability in our system that we now need to patch. So I would say that look for those vulnerabilities moving forward. Hey, here's a great piece of kit that we're providing. But if it's easily defeatable, if you have a $1 million kit defeated by a $100 option, we're not going to win, and especially in a near peer fight, a long term with that approach. Over.
Right. Yeah, we're definitely looking at functional availability as not being the best go forward metric for resiliency. We have to add the threat into that functional availability analysis. So I know General Raymond is focused on that. Commander Arnold, you get the last say here if you'd like to make any final comments.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, it's no mystery on our ships. We're losing a lot of top space access. We're just packing more and more into them. So for industry, miniaturization, getting things smaller, direct access, those are all would be important assets of future investments. I think the threat environment demands that operators need direct access to decision makers. You know, and act on orders and intent And so any investments in space and capability should follow along with that framework. I'd say overall, very warm mahalo for inviting me to participate in this space warfighting discussion today. It's been great. It says a lot about the Ascend virtual series, the aerospace sponsors, and the AIAA team in particular that they recognize the space warfighting contributions by all the joint services, a nice cross section of which are represented here today on this panel. So thanks again.
Thank you, Commander Arnold and Colonel Little, Colonel Putman and Colonel Roberson. Thank you guys very much. Thanks for what you do every day for your service to the country and to space operations. Look forward to another time where we can engage. Thank you.
Great, thank you to Kay and to all of our panelists today. And thank you to our audience members for joining us for A View from the Warfighter. And again, thank you to the Aerospace Corporation for underwriting this national security space track. Up next at 11:45 Eastern, please stay tuned for Integrating Across Acquisition featuring Michael Roberts, the Director of the Space Rapid Capabilities Office of the U.S. Space Force. Thank you.